All right, we should be live. For folks that are there, we're just gonna wait 2 minutes, and then we'll get started. If people who are late after that, they'll be all right. But we're just gonna give folks just a chance to trickle in. So give us 90 more seconds or so.
And if you're just joining, welcome. We're excited to have you here. We're going to have a great lineup all week long. Tonight we're going to start with a good session in just another minute.
Yep. Yeah, 6:02 Pacific. We'll kick things off. And feel free to add comments, questions in the chat there. We'll have Q&As at the end of every session. So if you want to leave questions throughout the talk, one of us will be making a note of them and bringing them back in at the end, or you can wait to ask your questions at the end. You guys can also talk to each other in those comment threads as well. So feel free to use this as much as possible. And then in the bottom there, you see a clap emoji, a confused and a mind blown. So feel free to use those in real time as well. All right, so it's 6:02. We'll get started for the folks that are here. Yeah, thanks for attending. We're excited to put this together. I think a lot of people don't know what a pangolin is. Some people do, but it's the most trafficked wildlife in the world. And I'm here with Paul, who is the founder of Save Pangolins, one of the top conservations working with the species, and he'll introduce himself in just a second. But throughout this week, we're going to be talking to lots of different experts around lots of different topics related to the pangolin. You'll be able to watch things on demand as well in the Run the World app if you miss any live session. If you have any questions for us, just shoot us feedback either on Save Pangolins Instagram or Animalia's. We'll also probably send an email around to my email. If everybody got the event invite this morning, you can hit me back too with any questions or comments. But just for a quick background, I am on the Animalia side. What we do is we basically are trying to connect people with conservations and programs in conservation and climate. So we do that through our weekly newsletter. Every Friday, we do that through our podcast series. We do it through events like this and experiences. Some offline experiences pre-COVID that we'll bring back when it's appropriate. And we also create apparel, T-shirts, hats, hoodies to raise money for conservation. This is our pangolin shirt, as you can see. Also looks like a Pokemon. I myself do some work in elephant conservation, and I reached out to Paul last summer, impressed by the work they were doing. And today's session is going to be Paul providing a quick overview on pangolins, and then Rachel Nuwer, who is going to be joining us momentarily, who's an investigative reporter, has written for both the New York Times and Nat Geo, will be joining us to discuss the COVID-19 link with pangolins. So with that, I'm going to sort of bow out, introduce you to Paul, let him give a background of Save Pangolins, our sort of main organization here, and give you an overview of the species, and then Rachel will join. So I'll come back at the end for the Q&A. And Paul, it's all yours, man.
All right. Thanks, James. Really appreciate it. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. I am really excited to be here tonight to speak about my favorite animal in the world, pangolins. And before I do that, I really want to just give a big thanks to James and his Animalia team. They've put in so much effort into creating this week of pangolin events. We've got a fantastic week of speakers lined up. So thank you for joining us tonight, and please definitely check out some of the other sessions that we have slated throughout the week. So now I'm going to give a sort of a introduction to pangolins, in case you're new to pangolins. And then in about 15 minutes or so, I'm going to be joined by Rachel Nuwer, and we're going to have a deeper discussion around pangolin trade and wildlife trafficking and the connections to COVID-19. So without further ado, I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. All right, so yes, here we are. Tonight we're going to be talking about this wonderful walking artichoke. Again, my name is Paul Thompson. I'm the co-founder of a conservation organization called Save Pangolins, and I've been doing pangolin work for about 10 years now. And in those 10 years, I generally get asked two questions, one of which is, you work with penguins? No, tonight we are not talking about these flightless birds, but instead we are talking about these guys, pangolins. So the other question I get asked all the time is, what is a pangolin? If you're new to pangolins, you're not alone. Most people still have never heard of pangolins, and that's, in fact, one of the biggest obstacles to their conservation. So we can touch on that later, too. But if you do know about pangolins and you're already a fan, don't worry. Hopefully you're going to learn something new and hear some great stories. So about 10 years ago, I co-founded Save Pangolins, and we are a conservation organization dedicated to protecting all 8 species of pangolins from extinction. And we do that through 2 primary strategies. One is raising awareness, and 2 is supporting frontline conservationists in Africa and Asia, the amazing people that you're going to hear from all week long that are doing incredible work in the field. So, pangolins. Pangolins are so unique and so bizarre. I first fell in love with pangolins, like I said, 10, 12 years ago, and I couldn't believe that I shared the planet with something that looked like a living dragon. So pangolins are the only mammal that are covered in scales, these very unique armor-like plates that are made of keratin. And penguins are sometimes called scaly anteaters because they strictly eat insects. And they are more closely, in fact, related to dogs and cats and bears, the order Carnivora, than they are anteaters or armadillos. So most people think there are 1 pangolin species, but in fact there are 8. 8 species of pangolins found, 4 species in Africa and 4 species in Asia. And these maps here indicate where those species live. So this guy here, this is a ground pangolin in southern Africa, and you can really get a sense that it is like a walking artichoke. So these scales that are perhaps their most unique attribute. The scales, almost like artichoke leaves, they're made of keratin, which is a protein that makes up your fingernail, okay? And some species of pangolins like this one live in arid, dry regions and savannas, and then others live in more tropical or forested areas. This is a black-bellied pangolin. And I think these 2 photos really indicate the diversity across the different species. So some species, like the previous one we just saw, the ground pangolin, are ground-dwelling and dig burrows and live, and sometimes dig tunnels and live underground. And then others are more arboreal, meaning they live up in trees. So pangolins, relatively new to science, and still so many mysteries remain. We still don't know fully exactly how long, on average, all wild pangolin species live. So we do know that some in captivity could live up to possibly 20 years. What we do know is that pangolins give birth on average to 1 live young, which is called a pup, a little pangolin pup. And that pangolin pup will ride on the base of the mother's tail and for several months after birth and cruise around with the mom. Now, pangolins have a very unique defense mechanism where they roll up into a ball when they feel threatened or vulnerable. And I think a lot of us these days especially can relate to that. When we're feeling pretty stressed about things happening in the world, you just want to curl up. The name pangolin, in fact, comes from the Malay word, which means to roll up. So as you can see, they curl into these tight balls that make them pretty much impenetrable to most of their natural predators. So they do have a few natural predators, including lions, leopards, hyenas. As you can see here, this was an amazing picture taken in Tanzania where this young lion kind of started munching on this curled up pangolin, kind of batting it around almost like a house cat would. But then after a while, it sort of gave up, it got bored, walked away, and then the pangolin eventually sort of unfurled itself, looked around, coast was clear, and off he went. Now, unfortunately, this characteristic, their defense mechanism, might work against their natural predators, but unfortunately it makes them very vulnerable to their human predators. So a poacher can come along and spook a pangolin, causing it to curl up, and then that makes it quite easy for a poacher to collect and put it in a net or a sack like that. And this is what we're seeing more and more, and what you've probably heard about, and of course what we're going to be talking about at length throughout the week, is why pangolins are in such high demand. So, two primary reasons why pangolins are threatened, and in fact all 8 species of pangolins are now threatened with extinction. So one is the consumption of their meat. Pangolin meat is consumed locally, regionally, and internationally. Sort of more locally, it's considered bush meat, which means people eat it almost as sort of their part of their daily diets, where it's something they enjoy. And then in other areas, such as in China and Southeast Asia, pangolin meat is actually a delicacy. It's a luxury good. So people are consuming it as a status symbol. Now, in addition to the consumption part, pangolins are also highly sought after for their scales. Their scales, that thing that makes them so unique, is also the thing that makes them so vulnerable, because pangolins are being poached at incredibly huge numbers. The vast majority of pangolins, something like 70%, are poached for their scales and trafficked mostly for destined to China. 70% of the international scale trade is headed to China. Other Asian countries too also use pangolin scales. Their scales are believed to be used as medicine to treat a variety of ailments, right? So it's not just one ailment that they're used for, but it's in fact quite a few. So arthritis, lactation issues, circulation issues. I've even heard reports of people starting to use it to treat cancer. All of this has added up to give the pangolin this dubious title of being the most illegally trafficked wild mammal on Earth. And this is something that's really surprising to a lot of people, because most people have never even heard of pangolins. So, in other words, pangolins are poached more often than tigers, rhinoceros, and elephants combined. So this is a devastating photo that came out in 2015 from a seizure of illegally transported pangolins, and there were approximately 4,000 pangolins being trafficked from Africa to Asia. Fast forward to last year, January 2019, there was a huge shipment. 8.2 tons of scales were intercepted by Hong Kong officials, originating in Nigeria and destined for Vietnam. 10,000 pangolins in one go. More recently, last year in April, a record 14-ton seizure in Singapore. And again, these are what you're looking at here are bags and bags of scales, pangolin scales, that were stuffed into a shipping container from Nigeria, destined for Asia. So that's pretty grim. It paints a grim picture for pangolins, especially after people are just starting to wake up to how amazing these animals are. So I often ask myself, like, is there still hope for pangolins? Do we still have time to save pangolins from extinction before they are vacuumed out of the forest and ending up on the dinner plate or the medicine cabinet? And the answer is yes. I do have a lot of hope for pangolins because of the amazing emerging movement for pangolin conservation that is showing up more and more recently. Here you have a snapshot of people in Africa and Asia that have dedicated their lives, from researchers to conservation biologists to educators, even influencers, are now getting on board to protect pangolins from extinction. You're going to hear about a lot of these folks next week, and so in a few minutes when Rachel comes back on board, we can talk a little bit more about some of the strategies that people are using to protect pangolins, including the work that we do through Save Pangolins. So again, I mentioned that we exist to raise awareness and to also support the people at the front lines of saving pangolins. We've created something called the Pangolin Crisis Fund last year, which is a really exciting new initiative that's meant to dramatically expand the amount of funding available to conservation. And we've had a fantastic start. But unfortunately, COVID has hit us hard, and so funding is tight, and we do need more help. And we invite you to be part of the effort. There's a lot of ways people can get involved, not just by donating, but by spreading the awareness. And again, we can sort of talk about that more. But please join us online, find our social media, and be part of the movement. So that is going to wrap up the Pangolins 101 section of tonight's talk. And now I'm going to invite Rachel Nuwer back on screen here.
Hi, everyone.
Good. She's there. Hey, Rachel.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Thank you. So Rachel and I are going to have a conversation now about the illegal wildlife trade, and specifically about pangolins and their links to COVID-19. A lot of people watching have probably heard in the news the association between pangolins and COVID-19. And so I think this is a great opportunity to shed some light on the latest findings. Things are developing day by day. So we're going to have that conversation now. But first, I'm so excited to be joined by Rachel because I've been a big fan of her work for many years. She's been writing incredible articles and books about the wildlife trade. So she has her finger on the pulse there. Rachel, do you want to introduce yourself and say a little bit about how you fell in love with pangolins?
Sure. So I originally also wanted to be a conservation scientist until I realized that I was very bad at math. I was much better at writing about science than I was at doing science. And I wanted to do all I could to help pangolins and other animals, and figured, I can do more good by writing about them than actually conducting research on them. So I fell in love with pangolins way back in 2010, feels like a lifetime ago. And I was conducting research for my master's degree in ecology in Vietnam. And I was working in a peat swamp forest way down in the south of the country. And I met some pangolin hunters firsthand. And just learning about these incredible species, unfortunately through the hunters, and also seeing some efforts in Vietnam to save them, really turned me on to pangolin conservation. And to be honest, just coming back to my university and hearing from other students who had never even heard about pangolins and getting them excited about pangolins, it inspired me.
Cool. Yeah. They're pretty lovable. So let's kick things off. Where should we begin? Where
do I begin? I mean, I'm the journalist. Let me start with a question. How did you get into pangolin conservation, Paul?
Yeah, so it was 2007. I was in a leadership fellowship program for people early in their careers of being wildlife conservationists. It was called the Emerging Wildlife Conservation Leaders. And that was when I found out about pangolins for the first time, and sort of was overcome with that moment of discovery where I was just like, these things are amazing. I can't
Pangolins will do that.
And most people had still never really heard about them. But then what was interesting was that moment of discovery was quickly overshadowed by kind of shock when I started finding out about the threats facing pangolins and how much they were starting to appear in the wildlife trade. And that's when I just felt compelled to take action. And, as somebody who lives in the United States, so I live in California, and so I'm not living where pangolins are. So I figured something I could do was to help sort of boost the movement and raise that awareness. So at the time there was you could Google pangolins and nothing came up except like this little Wikipedia page. So we
I remember that page.
Yeah. So we created our website, which was the first ever website dedicated to pangolins and conservation.
That's awesome. So why do you think it is that so few people still don't know about pangolins?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So, I mean, I'm a little biased, but I think pangolins are super charismatic, right? So it's not that they don't have enough fans out there once people know about them, but I think the problem is people haven't had the opportunity for to tell the story of pangolins. So I think historically, people they haven't been appearing in children's books or animated movies or things like that, and I think a lot of people sort of that's their first lens into a lot of the wildlife is through that sort of thing, and without pangolins in those, they don't know about them. And then interestingly, we don't have pangolins in many zoos. They're not easy to keep in captivity. So again, people haven't been able to draw such a connection. But what's been really neat to see is that in the 10 years we've been doing this, we have been seeing a massive rise in public awareness around pangolins. And then, of course, COVID has really shined a spotlight on pangolins.
Definitely. Yeah, I've sensed that rise as well. I mean, I don't know how many people listening today have celebrated World Pangolin Day, but I sure have.
Yeah, no doubt.
So yeah, speaking of COVID, what is the current thinking around this pandemic? Is it connected to a pangolin? Is it maybe connected to a pangolin?
Sure. So back in February, when things were still just ramping up, so to speak, some researchers from the South China Agricultural University put out a statement that essentially linked pangolin to being the source of the disease transmission from wild animal to humans. And that certainly caught a lot of people's attention because, of course, everybody wanted to find the source of this pandemic. And at the same time, a lot of people were like, what is a pangolin? Since then, it's been a really interesting story to track sort of the narrative and the research around it. To be clear, we still don't know with 100% certainty how the disease that caused COVID-19, which is called SARS-CoV-2, we don't know how it jumped from a wild animal to humans. The best guess at this point, like the most evidence suggests that pangolins are the intermediate host from a wild reservoir, so where the virus came from in the wild. So they believe that pangolins were the intermediate host that passed the virus from that wild reservoir to humans. So what we do know, right, is that it came from a wild animal, likely through the wildlife trade, and right now it's entirely possible, but we can't say with certainty that pangolins were that host. And they know that because several recent studies have looked at various pangolins and found that pangolins do carry coronaviruses, right? So coronavirus is a family of viruses, and the pangolins, a group of Sunda pangolins in China were found to carry coronaviruses that were about 88 to 92% similar to the virus that caused COVID-19. Therefore, we could say that it could have come from pangolins. But I think people are still looking for.
Yeah. Do you think we're ever going to find that answer, like the definitive answer?
It's an interesting question because a lot of people are saying we'll never know. Because samples weren't taken quickly enough from that wet market in Wuhan. So we might actually never know. And I think it's interesting. A lot of people ask me, like, what does it mean if we never find out? What does it mean for pangolins? Well, I would say there's a silver lining to it in that it has put pangolins in the spotlight.
Absolutely.
So ultimately, well, I don't know. We can talk about what it means, but yeah. What can I ask you a question now?
You may.
So you've covered it. You wrote a fantastic New York Times piece about how COVID-19 has affected the wildlife trade so far. Right?
Yes.
So what have you been hearing? What are some of the stories you've been hearing about how COVID-19 might be affecting the wildlife trade going forward?
So there's kind of two sides to that story. There's how is COVID-19 affecting the, let's call them the bad guys, and how is it affecting nations, governments, regulations, and just the public's perception of this problem. Starting with the first half of that story, I've heard from sources in the ground in Southeast Asia and in China that wildlife trafficking, including of just massive amounts of pangolin scales, has in some ways ground to a halt. Borders are closed, and just like the rest of us can't travel right now, we can't, go about our normal lives. Wildlife traffickers are also sort of in this sort of stuck moment. That said, there's no reason to think this stuck moment will last. It's kind of exciting because it gives police and investigators a window of opportunity to really dig in and maybe make some big key arrests while everything is ground to a halt. And while there's these huge piles of, pangolin scales and ivory just sitting around. But, we'll see if they can really jump at that opportunity. In Africa, there's rumors of poaching bosses wanting to take advantage of the lull in tourism and the pared down resources that rangers enjoy in the field to really go in and do a bunch of poaching. That's mostly I've heard about that in terms of ivory, but more and more these days, things like ivory are also shipped alongside pangolin scales because pangolin scales are just so highly sought after. They're so highly valued. There's evidence that they're going up in value in places like China. So governments, China, the signs there are really good. I think, China has banned consumption of most terrestrial species of wild animals. It's illegal now to eat a pangolin. Well, actually, it was illegal before. So it's illegal now to eat any wild animal except for things that come from the water, like frogs and turtles. Whether that's going to be permanently put into law, I don't know. I'm really hoping it will. My sources there are optimistic that it will. And the great thing about what China's doing is they're also approaching this from a number of other legal angles, pertaining, for example, to diseases among animals and human disease. So I'm really hoping that we're going to get some genuine change on the legal side in China that comes out of this. Other places, China's not the only place where pangolins are consumed. As you said, Vietnam, the prime minister there put out a call for a tightened draft language for legislation that would have pertained to pangolins. And that draft legislation was due on his desk April 1st. However, no one's heard anything about it. We're now at the end of May. So is anything really going to happen? Was it just talk in the sort of heat of the moment? I don't know. And evidence indicates that places like Indonesia, where there's also humongous amounts of pangolin trafficking, I think that image, that horrific image you showed was from Indonesia, they're even further behind. So it's a mixed bag.
It's definitely a mixed bag. I've been hearing this very similar stories. I do think so. I want to emphasize that. So on February 24th, when things were relatively early on, I guess, China did come out with that ban on the consumption of wild animals, including the hunting and trade of the consumption of wild animals. So that's really a fantastic sort of first effort, and a lot of conservationists were applauding China for making that move. And similarly, Vietnam's move to reform their wildlife laws as well. I think you made a great point that it's going to be really important to see that those policy reforms get enacted and enforced.
Yeah, definitely. It's one thing to make these pledges when we're all paying attention. It's another to follow through.
Yeah.
That said, though, I've been talking to sources who, are Chinese, are Vietnamese, been working on this for sometimes decades, and they tell me that they've never been so optimistic. So I'm trying to choose to be purposefully optimistic myself. And, on the flip side, if it doesn't happen now, I can't imagine what it would take to get this to change, to get some actual reform.
Absolutely. I think, people have always asked me, like why do pangolins matter? How does the illegal wildlife trade affect me? I mean, if ever there was something that demonstrates that the wildlife trade, the illegal wildlife trade, the unsustainable wildlife trade, whatever you call it, it matters. It affects all of us. I mean, billions of us are sitting in home. Thousands are dying, all stemming from unsustainable consumption of wild animals. And I think like the only thing that could be worse than what's happened over the last few months is if we don't learn from it and it repeats itself.
Absolutely. So do you think this will or maybe ultimately good or bad for pangolins? I mean, I've heard from some sources that some people on social media in, for example, China are like, oh, we should just kill all pangolins or kill all bats, get rid of all these horrible animals that give us these diseases.
Yeah. So it's, to be clear, pangolins are harmless to people unless we eat them. So to me, the answer is quite clear, and the message is clear, is that we should not consume pangolins. If we want to reduce our risk of the next zoonotic disease happening and causing a global outbreak, we simply say, look, do not eat pangolins. But it's really important to note that pangolins should not be persecuted as a result of their possible connection to COVID-19, because pangolins are harmless if we don't eat them. I think it also speaks a lot to the fact that, also similarly, like some people saying we should go and wipe out bats and clean out bat caves. Well, it's not that simple. Instead, we should just be giving space for wildlife and ensuring that there's adequate habitat. What we've been seeing in the last few years, especially, but over the last several decades, is as humans are encroaching more and more into wildlife habitat, we're being exposed to higher risks like zoonotic diseases. I think 70 or 75% of all emerging infectious diseases that are transmitted from animals to humans, all are coming from wildlife, and that's a huge percentage. So we need to figure out ways that we can more sustainably live and coexist with wildlife.
Definitely, yeah. I certainly agree that we need a radical reform to how we approach our relationship with nature. I mean, that said, what do you think could actually be done to tackle this, multi-billion-dollar trade, not just of pangolins, but of so many species of wildlife? I mean, what is a reasonable way that we can go forward and solve this?
Yeah, so I think it's starting with it starts with us, right? It starts with the consumers of threatened wildlife. So, for example, what's promising to me is that there has been since COVID happened, there was a survey done in China of about 100,000 people. And something like 90% of the people said that they no longer wanted to consume wild animals.
Do you know if those people were previous consumers, or were they just like random?
I'm not sure if they were, or it might have been mixed. I'm not sure.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I want to make a caveat that it's extra tricky to talk about this, because when we talk about wildlife trade, we're not only talking about the unsustainable or illegal wildlife trade, but sometimes there's perfectly legal wildlife trade, like eating wild Alaskan salmon, for example. That's technically wildlife trade. So we have to be careful about what we're talking about. But I do think that reform is important. And we have to, but it starts at the consumer, and we have to stop wanting to desire to eat those threatened products. And similarly with pangolins, especially, although the consumption of pangolins is illegal in China, it's still very much legal to prescribe pangolin scales in traditional Chinese medicine. And there's a big movement right now trying to get TCM practitioners to stop using pangolins and other threatened species and instead use more sustainable alternatives like various herbs, vegetables, things like that.
Definitely. Well, one very positive step in the right direction in terms of that pangolin medicine still being legal in China. I believe it was January this year, the government said, you know what, our national health system is no longer going to cover this. Like insurance won't pay for pangolin scale treatment. So, baby steps.
Baby steps. Yeah. And so in your reporting, what have you been hearing about sort of shifts like that, sort of cultural shifts or shifts in consumer behavior, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, small steps like that can build up over time into really large aggregate effects. I mean, China's banning of domestic ivory consumption in 2018 was huge. The issue there was that China didn't also follow it necessarily with the same level of action for things like pangolin scales and other things like, bear bile remains totally legal. I think the best signal to me of positive action is me just thinking back to how things stood in 2010, when I was a student, when I was just getting into this world of wildlife trade and trafficking. Very few people were talking about it. You didn't see stories in the New York Times about it. And now, pangolins have been the headline story of the New York Times science section. I think more and more people are becoming aware of it. And to me, that's the biggest cause for hope.
That's cool. But do you think, what do you think are the factors causing that sort of interest by the media or awareness? Is it because they're facing such crisis and people tend to go to crisis, or what is it?
Great question. Governments are paying more attention. There's a lot more talk about this at that sort of high level than there ever was before. And I think that's because of pressure from other governments. For example, the Obama administration made tackling wildlife trafficking a priority. The Trump administration has more or less followed through with that. The UK has also really hammered home a lot of attention about this. And yeah, I think it's just people don't respond to things until they absolutely have to, until it reaches crisis proportions. I mean, look at climate change. We know we should do something about it. We're not. We're kind of dawdling. But I think poaching reached such absolutely epidemic levels with rhinos and elephants in Africa that people could no longer just turn a blind eye or wait for it to go away on its own. People were really faced with the prospect of losing some of these iconic species. Maybe a pangolin's not an iconic species, but luckily the pangolin has sort of ridden that wave of interest and outrage over this issue. The media's just gotten a lot better about reporting on it, maybe thanks to more online platforms. I'm not even sure. I've been writing a lot about it nonstop for the past almost 10 years. It's kind of my mission to get the word out there. So just a confluence of factors, I think, but there's definitely still a long ways to go. A lot of this talk is in the Western media. I think we need to figure out what it is we can do to better change people's minds in Asia. Mm-hmm. And that change needs to come from within as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There's going to be a great talk on this subject on Thursday, I believe. The Wild Aid is going to be talking about their work campaigning in China and Vietnam and other parts of Asia to change the hearts and minds of consumers there. So that should be great. Now, I've heard a lot of reports that pangolin scales, like you mentioned earlier, pangolin scales are often trafficked in the same sort of shipments and routes as elephant ivory, but also as well as narcotics and firearms and sometimes human trafficking too. Have you come across some of this in your reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing that people have to realize is when we're talking about pangolin trafficking, we're not talking about a poor farmer who's just trying to feed his family for the night. We're talking about organized international criminal gangs, and they're going to make money in whatever way they can. If that's drugs, great. If that's arms, great. Oftentimes, wildlife trade is just a very easy way to make money because there's less resources and attention paid to it than those other forms of crime. And I think that's just historically because, people pay attention to people. A lot of animals are just glossed over, and a lot of cultures, including ours until relatively recently, just didn't pay animals any attention. They were seen more as objects, things to be used for human benefit, not, life forms with their own sentient feelings.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we can turn that tide. Yeah. So it seems in this day and age that there's so much information circulating around out there.
Definitely.
I sort of want to shift to how people can help, right? So how people out there listening can get involved or get help. So perhaps, let me start by asking you sort of, it's an infodemic as much as a pandemic right now, in that there's a lot of weird false news circulating around. So as a reporter, as a journalist, what would you recommend people in terms of how they stay up to speed?
And I have Facebook. I struggle with this every day, seeing, my old high school friends posting about like the pandemic and things. I would just urge people to go with, trusted, vetted, legitimate news sources like the New York Times. National Geographic has an entire desk called Wildlife Watch dedicated to wildlife trafficking stories. The Guardian, just trusted news sources. I'll do a quick plug. I wrote a whole book about poaching called Poached: Inside the Dark World of Wildlife Trafficking. And you can meet lots of very cool pangolins and the people trying to save them, and some people trying to kill them in the book. So there's a lot of resources out there if you're interested. But yeah, I would urge you to please go with the sort of tried and true legitimate news sources.
Cool. Yeah, good. We also we keep a blog up to date on our website, savepangolins.org, and we've just created a COVID section with like a FAQ.
Oh, very cool. That's awesome.
People want sort of the facts, not just not speculation, but what we know right now. That you can find on our website.
Yep. Yeah, I forgot to plug the scientists. So yeah, trusted NGOs as well, and scientists themselves.
Yeah.
One question I get that I'd love to ask you is, it's really easy to feel despondent. Many of us are sitting here in the West in countries without pangolins, but what can just average people do to help pangolins and other animals?
Yeah, great question. And I truly believe, look, this happened to me. I was inspired to do something for pangolins, and I was able to. I didn't have to, I'm a terrible scientist, and I don't live in, Cameroon or in Vietnam. So it goes to show, my point is that anybody can do something. You just have to find out what your little piece is and do it. Now, we've talked a lot about awareness and facts. Right now, pangolins really struggle because, a lot of people perhaps love pangolins that are listening right now, but there's still so many people. Every day I'm meeting people who still think I'm talking about penguins, right? They just don't know what pangolins are. So spreading the awareness, truly, it sounds maybe light and fluffy, but it really does make a difference. If people are able, they should support conservation groups. So find a pangolin project that inspires them. There's going to be, of course, many this week, but give donations if you can, especially right now. People are really struggling. I will give a little plug too for Save Pangolins. We are well connected, and we are existing in support of conservationists. So I can guarantee that if you give a donation to Save Pangolins, we're going to stretch that donation as far as we possibly can. But those are good things to do. But just spread the word for sure.
Spread the word. Yeah, it's an easy thing to do.
Yeah. What's your next project? What are you working on?
Oh gosh, I am wading into the very controversial subject of trophy hunting. So I was supposed to be over in Africa right about now, but we'll see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that should be exposing some interesting characters too.
Indeed. Yeah. I'll take any opportunity I can to get over there though.
Yeah. Cool. All right.
Totally. Should we take some audience questions?
Yeah, let's invite James back on screen.
Yeah.
We can get some audience Q&A going. I haven't been able to keep up with the chatter, but I see that there's some good questions coming in. Annie is telling you to go get them, Rachel. Get those.
Thanks, Annie.
Hey.
Hey, James.
Hey.
So yeah, I was able to track some of the questions from the audience members, and we'll start the Q&A. I apologize if I missed some of your questions. There's a lot firing in the comment thread, but you can also ask them right now because we'll start the Q&A. So let me kind of go through some of these. So one of the questions, there's a couple of folks, Rachel, Julian, asking what happens to the confiscated scales and meat when they are confiscated? Like, where do they go?
So it's usually there's very little transparency into that question. It depends on where they're confiscated. So in the U.S., they often go to a repository out near Denver. But in other places, they might actually be legally auctioned off by the government to make money. In China, there's basically rumors that they're just put back into this big legal government supply to be sold back to pharmacies. So unfortunately, it's not always a responsible way that they're disposed of.
And that goes into, I think you used the word transparency, which is key, right? So a lot of governments should be held accountable to be more transparent with their enforcement, because it's fantastic that the work that the officials are doing to intercept those pangolin seizures. But after that, it's a bit of a black box. So we don't know where those pangolin scales are going. And if they're just getting back into the system, there's huge levels of corruption in a lot of countries, kind of all over. So it's something that really needs to be addressed.
Absolutely.
Earlier, Jennifer asked, how do people still believe in scales as medicine, given sort of modern science and technology? Obviously, this is a deeply cultural thing in most cases. But do you guys want to kind of expand upon that question?
I'll just say that I think believe is the key word there, because this is a very, very deep cultural practice in terms of the pangolin skills, going back probably millennia. And it's almost more akin to a faith-based belief than it is a scientific one. It's like telling somebody here in the US who's a Christian, like, oh, there's no God because there's no scientific proof. People aren't looking for scientific proof. It's ingrained in the system culturally. Paul, do you have something to add to that?
I think it's really well said. Yeah. So there are no documented scientific studies talking about pangolin scales having an effect on the ailments that they're used to treat. But like Rachel's saying, it's not about what a research study says in a paper, right? It's about what your mother used, your grandmother before her, and your great grandmother before her. And if that's something that's part of your culture and has been for hundreds or thousands of years, it's not so easy to simply just dismiss. And I think that's something it's really difficult for a lot of us in the West to understand. And I think there, interestingly, with traditional Chinese medicine, there are in fact a lot of proven health benefits to various TCM practices. So it's not right to throw out all of TCM. We can't say that. It's no good vilifying it. So that's why we promote the use, let's find sustainable alternatives to instead of using pangolin scales and other threatened wildlife in traditional Chinese medicine.
And I'll just very briefly add, there is also great uptake among traditional medicine doctors of shifting to these sustainable alternatives. In Vietnam, there's a lot of doctors who are going, pure herbs, getting rid of all the animal stuff. And that's a great, great development, because a lot of people just listen to what their doctors say. There was a young man I interviewed who was, I think, 31, well-educated. He was an architect. And he was using tiger products. And I asked him why. And he said, because my doctor prescribes them. And I was like, well, if your doctor prescribed a herb, would you just go with them? He's like, well, yeah, of course. I do what my doctor says. So if we can convert the actual doctors, I think we could make a lot of progress.
Yeah. And one thing I'll just add real quick there is culture is very hard to change from laws and regulation. Culture has to really change from within. And so it's on the leaders of those cultures to sort of to act in that way. Tori brought up an article from the BBC that sort of talked to the increase we're seeing in poaching during the pandemic because of people being forced to turn to bushmeat and alternative sources of food and income. And just wanted to get your thoughts on that. I think a lot of people see articles right now that the pandemic is great for nature and less pollution and all things, but does not translate right now to great things happening for wildlife on a number of fronts. Do you guys want to kind of comment on what's happening with pangolins in the last 3 months? Have you seen any shifts in poaching or local protection?
I know a lot of the talk in Africa, and actually I think Annie in the comments would know more because she wrote a story about this for the New York Times, but a lot of that talk surrounds elephant poaching and rhino poaching. I personally haven't heard of an uptick in pangolin poaching, but I can't think of any reason why that wouldn't be the case. But Paul probably has more visibility into that.
Yeah, so a few different factors might be driving up poaching levels, and it's also hard. You can't say poaching is increasing across the board. It's very much sort of site specific. But given that, like you mentioned, James, there's sort of people are needing alternative sources of income, so they might be drawn to poaching now when they weren't before. Or similarly, like tourism has just completely fallen out in Africa, right? So there's less people and therefore less revenue that go into a lot of these areas. So there's essentially like less eyes and ears on the ground, and therefore some people are expecting elevated levels of poaching. In terms of pangolins specifically, yeah, we don't yet know what the poaching levels are like. We do know that the pangolin price has maintained high, so we haven't seen a huge drop. There are challenges, like Rachel talked about earlier, there's a lot of challenges in terms of connecting sellers and buyers and traffickers. But it seems that, you know, it's too soon to tell what the long-term implications are going to be.
Annie actually asked, what is the volume? Do we see any pangolin scales, especially on the medicine side, trade happening in the U.S.? Do we see pangolin-based scales or medicine coming into the U.S. at all today?
Strangely, we actually see pangolin scale cowboy boots. Yeah, I read a story about that for National Geographic recently. But there is a large Asian American community here, and people bring their traditions with them. I remember reading maybe a year ago about an entire frozen pangolin found in the freezer at like a Chinese supermarket in Canada. I don't know that there's been any solid studies on the quantities of pangolins coming to the US or to North America, but it's definitely happening.
Yeah. There's a couple comments and questions around just clarifying, this is probably for you, Rachel, that in China, they have banned, they're continuing to strike down consumption of meat, but nothing substantial has happened on pushing back on the medicinal use.
Right. The way that the experts I've interviewed who are on the conservation side of things have sort of explained this to me is, yeah, it's not perfect. There are loopholes, but this is such a good start, and conservation groups are always strapped for cash and for resources. If the ban on meat goes through, at least now they can focus all their attention on the medicine side of things.
Yep. Yeah. Rachel just asked, are there any international organizations that have enough power and ability to help hold China and accountable the medicinal trade of pangolins? Are there any international organizations really in a position to do that, or does it really have to happen within China?
So generally speaking, China responds better to praise and being sort of highlighting what they're doing well rather than sort of being like overtly critical. So I think the organizations that are most effective at working in China or with China are those that understand like China's strengths and then work with them to sort of bolster those strengths. So working on policy reform that or commending them for good policy reform, providing them with information to help further reform. Like right now, we're seeing we're seeing a potential revision of their wildlife law, and people are like we talked about earlier. There's hope. There's hope that they might close some of those loopholes, especially around the trade. So I again come to Wild Aid's talk on. Is that Thursday? I think it's Thursday.
Yeah.
They have a presence in China, and they're doing really good work there. There's another number of other organizations doing good work. But yeah, I think it's got to be a top-down and a bottom-up approach in China.
Another question I get often is, we know pangolins are the most trafficked wild animal today. Has this always been the case, but it's just it's been happening more under the radar? Or has there been a spike in pangolin poaching and demand within the last 10, 20, 30 years, possibly as a result of ivory getting cracked down on and these other things? Keratin is also rhino horn, right? And that getting harder and harder. Has this always been going on these levels, but now we just know more about it? Or has there actually been a recent spike in pangolin poaching?
Yeah, I can touch on that. So pangolin trading and trafficking has taken place for hundreds of years. The use in traditional Chinese medicine, for example, is not a new thing. So that's always been happening. The levels, though, that of pangolin trafficking right now are sort of unprecedented, and it's on the rise. So 185 tons of pangolins have been seized from the trade just since 2015, and something like 3/4 of all seized pangolins have happened in just the last 2 years. So that indicates that the rate is increasing, and there are a lot of market forces at play there. So as ivory trafficking has decreased, a lot of those same bad guys have switched to trafficking pangolin scales. It has always been happening under the radar for sure, without much awareness. But the levels of trafficking have definitely been dramatically greater in the last few years.
We are coming up on the top of the hour. So the folks that didn't get your questions answered, you actually can ask Paul and Rachel in the Run the World app. There's a thread just for this talk. And at least for the next day or so, they'll be on there. So feel free to reach out and hit them up. So sorry, we couldn't get to all the questions. Thank you, Rachel, so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and Paul for partnering up and putting this together. Thanks everybody for attending our first session. Real quick, tomorrow we have a really interesting session with a gentleman named Ade who works in a pangolin rehabilitation center in Singapore, and it's going to be our only session that actually features a live pangolin. We're going to meet one of the pangolins that they have rescued and are rehabbing, and will be repopulating back into the wild, and he'll actually be walking us through that whole process. So that's tomorrow at 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern. So yeah, thanks everybody. Keep the questions going in the app. And Rachel, thank you so much. So kind of you to join us.
My pleasure. And thanks everybody for tuning in. Thanks so much for your interest.
Cool. Thanks everyone. Have a good night. Stay safe.